Welcome everyone to the Gender and International Relations online conference. Right now, we have the pleasure to have Dr. Brooke Ackerly today with us, who is gonna give the conference titled In Need of Decoloniality, Grounded and Engaged Normative Theory for Feminist International Relations. Right now, I'm gonna yield the floor to Mariela Pajes, who's gonna be the moderator of the session. So Mariela, you have the word.
Thank you, Tadeo. First of all, welcome, Dr. Brooke. It's an honor to have you here today. And I'm going to proceed to give a little brief about you in order our forum can meet you pretty much. Okay, so Professor Ackerly is professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. She's co-editor-in-chief of the International Feminist Journal of Politics. In her research, teaching, and collaborations, she works to clarify without simplifying the most pressing problems of global justice, including human rights and climate change. Using feminist methodologies, she integrates into her theoretical work empirical research on activism and the experiences of those affected by injustice. Say political theory and feminist social criticism, universal human rights in a word of difference, doing feminist research with Jackie True, and most recently, Just Responsibility, a human rights theory of global justice. She is currently working on the intersection of global economic, environmental, and gender justice in their material and epistemic dimensions. She teaches courses on justice, ethics, and public policy, feminist theory, feminist research methods, human rights, contemporary political thought, and gender and the history of political thought. She is a winner of the Vanderbilt College of Arts and Science Graduate Teaching Award and the Margaret Cunningham Mentoring Prize. She is the founder of the Global Feminist Collaborative, a group of scholars and activists developing ways to collaborate and applied research for social justice. She advises academics and donors on evaluation methodology and the ethics of research. She serves the profession through committees in her professional associations, including the American Political Science Association, APSA, also the International Studies Association, ISA, and the European Consortium on Politics and Gender, ECPG. She currently serves on the APSA Committee for the Status of Women in the Profession. She has been a member of the editorial board for Politics and Gender and is currently a member of the editorial boards of the Political Research Quarterly, Journal of Politics and Politics, Gender, and Identities. It's a pleasure to have you here. Now I'm gonna lead you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here. Let me make sure as I share my screen that you're looking at a sunset and that there's a title in the corner. Is that what you're looking at?
Yeah, is that what we're looking at?
Marvelous. Okay. So nice to be here. I'm very grateful. It's really an honor, and you've done just a beautiful job in arranging things from your correspondence with folks across various time zones. I'm very grateful, Tadeo. It's been great working with you, and you've been very patient with me. Haziel, you've handled the technology beautifully. And Mariella, that was just a gorgeous invitation and an introduction. You've looked all the way through my past, and I'm quite honored that you spent the time to do that. So thank you very much. I also want to where I am and say some thanks here because I have found this monument, which in 2019 was installed at the riverfront in Nashville, Tennessee, where Vanderbilt is based. There has historically been the original fort of Nashboro, which was the first settler colonial town. It just speaks a range of Indigenous communities who have made this place their place, and they have also made their livelihoods here. So it's important to acknowledge that history because it is more complicated than we can tell in a quick land acknowledgement. And the other thing I like about this monument is that in addition to naming the peoples who were here, both living and hunting, it's a great place to hunt because you really didn't have to do anything. There was a salt lick, and the native communities had cultivated the forests so that it was attractive for animals to come to the salt lick and to drink the water. There's lots of creeks all over the place. And so it was really a very fertile place for a community to support itself. Around the base of this monument, you see individual people mentioned. And they are all and each important to the history of this place and subsequently the history of the place in relation to settler colonialists, which is going to be a theme throughout my talk. So the full title of the talk is In Need of Decolonial Theory, Grounded in Engaged Normative Theory for Feminist IR. I'm going to begin my talk with a little bit of an introduction of why I think this is important. And it does come from my experience as an editor and my experience as a researcher in the landscape that forms the background of this slide, which is southwestern Bangladesh. That is a very different settler colonial context from Nashville, Tennessee. It was settled by Anglos much earlier, well, actually about the same time actually as Nashville, but in a very different context. It wasn't settled, it was a place of colonialism more than settler colonialism, whereas where I am is really a site of settler colonialism. So I'm going to introduce you to where I came to the topic. And then I'm going to walk you through 3 modes of inquiry that I've used throughout my career: grounded normative theory, feminist social criticism, and a feminist research ethic. This approach of using theory and ethics to look into feminist IR and gender and IR is the question that was posed to me by the hosts of this conference. And I, in part because it was quite time, given what I've been working on. So what I want to argue then is that these modes of doing feminist IR theory invite us to take seriously an idea from colonial theory, from Indigenous theory, which is grounded normativity, and to reflect very carefully, particularly as a settler colonialist, to reflect very carefully about what it means to understand an idea and a set of theoretical practices developed in one context and across a range of struggles in order to enhance our learning that we may then apply across context. I argue that feminist IR itself is in need of decolonial theory because it continues to go to places. And when we are committed to looking in particular sites to understand international relations, we are then committed to a methodology that makes us attentive to our process, or so I will argue today with you. So first of all, where does this problem come from? Feminist IR is at a crossroads. It is a huge field with many. However, it has come to these strengths across a journey. And through that journey, we have developed and borrowed important ideas from other parts of the field of feminist inquiry. And some of these are very important to us ideologically, theoretically, and in practice. And yet, I want to call on us to pay attention to how important it is to think about what we're saying and what we do and how we do it. So I'm going to invite us to recognize that intersectionality is one of the most common concepts that we utilize. We want to make sure that we know what we're saying when we say that, and that we then draw clearly from what we say to how we should do our work. I want us to disaggregate the idea of the global north. Just yesterday, a group of publishers from the global north and global south together were discussing whether we should put the phrase global north in our commitment to taking on the challenges of global hierarchies. And we worried as we did that to include the phrase global north might oversimplify the narrative of what we mean to be taking on when we think about north-south politics, but also to exclude global north would be to, or rather not to explicitly mention it and center it, would be to de-emphasize one of the key axes of power at work in, certainly in feminist publishing, as we were discussing yesterday, but in feminist IR and international relations more generally. Third, I want to invite us to disaggregate settler colonialism, as I just did, in a comparison between my research site in southwestern Bangladesh and the place where I live and work in Nashville. Colonialism looks different when it's a settler experience versus when it's an extractive experience. Not that a settler experience isn't also extractive, but I want us not to oversimplify the narrative of what settler colonialism requires us to attend to when we turn to colonial theory to expand our work. Fourth, I want us to think a lot about whiteness. A colleague once said to me when we were discussing a very difficult topic, she said, look, sometimes if it looks like whiteness and it sounds like whiteness, I think it's whiteness. And I understood that that was a useful shorthand for her to try to get underneath the power dynamics at work. But when we look at concrete situations, what whiteness is doing can be quite different. And in fact, to simplify the narrative about whiteness might very well be to reify constructions of racism that impede anti-racism. So if we recognize that there is a power dynamic in utilizing racism to put people in poverty in opposition against each other based on race, then by utilizing whiteness, we obfuscate the power move that's being made in that framing. And then finally, by way of introduction, when we think in these decolonial ways, when we disaggregate these key concepts, do what they need to do? Or does decolonial thinking require that we reinvigorate our methods so that they can do what we've asked them to do? The next part of my talk is going to set out the three main approaches that I've been using throughout my career. Many of them I have developed individually, but they come into fruition through collaboration. So grounded normative theory is the idea that as a political theorist, that's my background as a normative theorist, wrestling with, as normative theorists, the key questions of justice, injustice, human rights, that is, things that matter to real people in their lived experience. To understand those, we do best not just to engage with the history of political thought on those topics, but also to do our own empirical, engaged work with those who are in struggle regarding those same things. So if we are interested in understanding inequality, it's not enough to reflect from our comfortable spaces about what inequality means, but rather we want our understandings of inequality to be informed by people who are struggling with and disadvantaged by inequality in their lived experience, in their daily lives. So in a co-authored piece with Luis Cabrera and Fauna Foreman, Genevieve Fuji-Johnson, Chris Tenove, and Anja Wiener, we have argued that there are 4 elements of normative theory which guide those of us who do this work, even though we do it in a range of ways. Some of us more or less solidaristic, that is really in collaboration with the people we're working with. So we do have different approaches, but across these range of approaches, we have 4 commitments: to comprehensiveness, that is, to making sure that the insights that inform our theorizing are broad, that we are looking broadly at the insights, claims, interests, and a broad range of actors who are experiencing the normative question at stake. That we are recursive, that when we inform ourselves about people's lived experience, that we can get back to that. We do some analysis to understand what that theory is, and then we bring it back to the community. So for example, in the book that Marla referred to, Just Responsibility, after developing the theory of just responsibility, that is, what does it mean to take responsibility for injustice outside of my community, but that very deeply affects others? What does it mean to responsibly offer that theory that comes from people's struggle to the world? Well, the first thing is to go back. Well, I guess the first thing was to develop the theory with the empirics from those communities. But the second thing is to go back to those communities, share with them the insights that I gained by working with them, and then recursively modifying the theory as appropriate so that it continues to speak not just from their insights, but also to their insights. That process enables us to be attentive to epistemological inclusion. So are we attending to the range of ways of knowing and the range of insights and the range of knowledge that are involved in a particular struggle? So in the case of the example that I just cited, I was working with a range of women's human rights activist organizations, and then quite deeply with a few of those organizations who were working in labor issues. And in those contexts, I wanted to make sure that I was getting a range of labor experiences, from domestic workers to garment workers. That is, from those workers whose work cannot be tied to a particular brand name, those workers whose work takes place in private, as domestic workers do, and those workers whose work can be tied to a brand name, which opens up a realm of activism that is not available to domestic workers, and also work that is done more in public. And then finally, epistemic accountability. Grounded normative theory, engaged normative theory involves being intellectually accountable to the truth of, to the lived experience of those. The second way of doing this work that I have developed and used throughout my career is feminist social criticism. That is work that is grounded, it is a methodology for engaging in any critical inquiry, any feminist inquiry, but really I argue any critical inquiry needs to use these tools. The methodology comes from the work that feminists of color around the world were developing in order to do political theory that charted as the non-aligned movement in the 50s and 60s charted, following a third way. So not following a mainstream, not following a critical, but also settler colonial driven critical trend, but rather finding a third way, their own way, that came from their own lived experience and intellectual traditions. Looking at that work with from a range of scholars and scholar activists, across a range of experiences, nationalities, and ethnic and racial identities, I identified 3 parts of a dynamic process of feminist social criticism. Deliberative inquiry, that is gathering a range of views and putting them in dialogue with one another, either directly or virtually. Skeptical scrutiny, this idea comes from a Supreme Court decision that Ruth Bader Ginsburg made with regard to an all-male institution in the United States. And she argued that if we have a tradition of gender inequality, and it's possible that this institution perpetuates that gender inequality, we should probably look at it and ask. And they found that indeed it did. And I think that's what my colleague was getting at when she said, looks like whiteness. If we have a tradition of whiteness as being an axis of oppression and hierarchy, we should probably look to see if it's at work in this context. That's what skeptical scrutiny is. And then guiding criteria are that while we live with and respect epistemological difference, that doesn't mean that we need to allow relativism to undermine our ability to make critical claims as we engage in struggles for justice. And in light of that, we engage in guiding criteria. So if out of our struggles come key commitments, we can then use those, aware that we may need to revise them through deliberative inquiry and skeptical scrutiny over time, but provisionally we can use them. This theory was picked up by Katia Confortini, and she examined another social movement, different from the ones that I had used to develop that. She was looking at WILP, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and she found that working across difference, they had to develop a relational idea of intelligent compassion. So what I'm arguing is that feminist social criticism provides a way of doing its work, and yet it invites us to revise even it. And I'm going to argue today that the idea of grounded normativity, as Leanne Beta-Somase-Simpson has offered it, offers us yet another way of developing this theory. At the call of Iris Marion Young, I then took that feminist social criticism idea and applied that methodology to the question of universal human rights. And this book, Universal Human Rights in a World of Difference, offers us a theory of universal human rights that respects the diversity around the world without undermining the capacity of activists around the world for using human rights as a tool for their activism. So the feminist scholar asks a set of key questions about how to do their work in IR. One is to ground it in experience. So what counts as key historical information? Bina da Costa says that the rapes of Bengali women during the War of Partition, and again, the War of Independence of Bangladesh from Pakistan is important to that. We want to ask whose human experience do we need to observe and which experiences should we observe? The feminist scholar interrogates the evaluation techniques that she has been using and wants to reapply them to develop the critiques themselves. A feminist scholar wants her work, feminist IR, to have emancipatory potential in a range of ways. And obviously then it has to be recursive. This is why feminist social criticism is a appropriate methodological tool, sort of macro methodological tool for feminist international relations and feminist inquiry more generally. So Jackie True and I collaborated in articulating how we might take that normative theory of feminist social criticism as a way of doing feminist IR into what we call the feminist research ethic. So that is a commitment to, in all of our research practices, reflecting on the power of epistemology, reflecting on all of the boundaries, not just national boundaries, but boundaries that get constructed through power politics, through the power of epistemology, and reflecting on relationship. That is, how are these ideas related? How are these people related? And our relationships as researchers to each other and in partnership with those with whom we are doing research. If you are not familiar with decolonial theory, you might not recognize that feminist research ethic to grounded normativity in decolonial theory. Grounded normative theory, feminist social criticism, and a feminist research ethic are in fact all calling out for, looking for, wanting to be attentive to what decolonial theory requires of us. A definition of grounded normativity that comes from a decolonial theory is that offered by Glenn Coulthard in Red Skin, White Masks. And I'm quoting here, I call this place-based foundation of Indigenous colonial thought and practice grounded normativity, by which I mean the modalities of Indigenous land-connected practices and long-standing experiential knowledge that inform and structure our ethical engagements with the world and our relationships with human and non-human others over time. I'm going to unpack this idea and work with it over the next, the remainder of my talk. So it involves land-connected practices. By reconnecting with the history of the land in Nashville, I have come to understand questions that I have been engaged with better as a result of becoming connected with the politics of this place over history. But what he means is not what I, as a settler colonialist, can and should do. He's describing where his DNA, where his indigenous knowledge comes from. It comes from long-standing experiential knowledge accumulated across generations who have lived on the land. Though arguably, they have not always been able to live on the same land. They have had to migrate, forced or otherwise, due to settler colonial practices. As Kyle White argues, they were the first to experience climate change because they were forced to leave one climate for another in the United States. These long-standing experiential knowledges grounded in these land-connected practices do inform and structure our ethical engagements and relationships with one another, with the world, and with other humans, but also with other non-humans. And most importantly, perhaps, is over time, transgenerationally, further back than I, as a settler colonialist, can even imagine remembering. So there should and are many influences, Indigenous influences on international relations. I've highlighted a few here just to draw your attention in case you are unfamiliar with these works. And I realize that Veronica's name has a random act of capitalization in the middle of it. I'm sorry about that. But I'm going to focus on Leanne Simpson's particular articulation for a few reasons that should become clear as I proceed. But maybe I should just highlight that of these I've cited here, she is probably the least intentionally working on a theory of international relations. And yet it is explicit in her work, which I think illustrates the value of this approach. So she is a Anishinaabe scholar. For those who don't know, that is from the Anishinaabe group, which is the Great Lakes region. It was a migratory community prior to settler colonialism, so it has a quite complicated and very interesting history. She, in addition to being the scholar that you would come to know her to be from reading this book, is also a wonderful storyteller and has a new novel novel out. Perhaps following Sandra Harding, a tendency to disaggregate ontology, epistemology, and methodology, arguing that we need to be clear about what one is because the others follow from it. She does not disaggregate these. She integrates them. And she also makes sure that we understand what we're doing is pedagogy. We are teaching ourselves our ontology, who we are in relation to this world. We are sharing, developing, passing on our epistemology, celebrating its brilliance, as we'll see in the next slide. Are developing our own pedagogy, but we're also listening to the land. The land is pedagogy in her framing. And she has a way of understanding methodology that far exceeds the narrow framing that we generally use in our research. Hers includes the language that we know, this idea of this gendered idea. She has a whole chapter on that as methodology. She offers an explicit international relations, which I'll be talking about, anti-capitalism, not merely anti-extractivism, settler colonialism, and finally. So I've talked a bit already about the land as pedagogy. Anishinaabe brilliance, these are the key elements of the theory. Anishinaabe brilliance is that reassertion, reaffirmation, resurgence of community-based, land-based knowledge, reaffirmation of the lessons that the land has taught us, reaffirmation of what we've learned in community. I am using we in an appropriate sense, if you count me as part of that we. It's the we in the title, as we have always done. She's writing for and from Anishinaabe community. And we'll talk a bit about what it means at the accountability bullet. For me, as a settler colonial consumer of this book, to be thinking about this work in this way and how to do that. Her argument is relational. There are no boundaries between land, human, and non-human others, which you saw Glenn Coulthard also making that point. It is transgenerational, as we saw in Glenn Coulthard's account, really going back to before I can remember those ancestors, and thinking forward about what my grandchildren's great-grandchildren will be experiencing. That's the sense of my responsibility to the world. I'm responsible for carrying forward the knowledge that my grandparents, great-grandparents developed. I have to recover it if settler colonialism has oppressed it, and then I need to take it forward. So international relations. International relations for her are between nations. So that is she, as a Anishinaabe person, learning from Glenn Coulthard, a Dene person. That's what she means by international relations. The rest of us, if we are worthy, are comrades. So she talks about Black feminists as being comrades. And the final piece that I need in order to wrestle with this question of who are we, who are not Anishinaabe, to be engaging with this text and using it. Well, it's clear, as I said, that it is not written for settler colonialists, but I do take it I read it as making me feel called to be a comrade, even though she is not calling me to be a comrade. I realize that working across languages, that may seem awkward, but when I read it, I feel called. But she is not taking this text and calling on me to do anything. That latter would be to center. whiteness and settler colonialism. So to conclude, what I argued at the introduction is that we as feminist researchers in international relations have to pay deep attention to the problem of saying versus doing, which is why I always center my methodology in making my arguments. And I also engage with every student and colleague whose work I read or with which I engage. I always think about those methods and what it means to be recommitted to them. Why does feminist IR need decolonial theory? Because we need to reinterpret normative theory, grounded normative theory, that first methodology with which I began. We need to ask, is it comprehensive with respect to Indigenous peoples? Is it recursive, revisiting the meaning of our core ideas in light of being increasingly comprehensive? Are we practicing epistemic inclusion? And what would it mean to be epistemically accountable to a author, a community, a set of ideas for whom we are not the intended audience? Decolonial theory invites us to reapply feminist social criticism. Feminist social criticism, like grounded normative theory, is designed to be reapplied. And so we need not just to call our work decolonial, but to really do it. To use a metaphor from gambling, we need to double down. We need to ask ourselves what it means to recommit, to recycle, to reapply feminist social criticism, and how might we develop that further so that it continues to be accountable epistemically, even to those outside of our imaginations at the time of first study. We want to recommit to a feminist research ethic. That means reflecting on the power of epistemology. To reflect on the power of epistemology does in fact mean to look at boundaries in a new way, relationships and relationship in a recommitted way. So let me take this back home just to illustrate the point. There's been an awful lot of gender and international relations right here in my land, and I have not paid attention to it for my entire career of studying gender and international relations around the world. There is the slavery settler colonial connection. The first slaves brought to Nashboro came to defend the white settlers from Native Americans who were resisting settler colonialism. There is a connection between democracy and settler colonialism. Andrew Jackson, who is the author and executor of the removal of Indigenous peoples from these areas, is also celebrated in the United States as a reinvigorator of democracy, making our Constitution and our politics ever more democratic. And yet that happened by offering settlers free land ever westward. And then the construction of whiteness and settler colonialism. Settlers who came west, in fact, settlers who came to the shores of the United States, those white settlers, obviously slaves were under different conditions, but those white settlers were brought with a promise of opportunity. And at each failed opportunity, and for most of those aspirational settlers, there was not a lot of settling going on. Mostly they were unsuccessful at being able to provide for themselves and their families, to establish the way of life that had been promised. And so there was always this promise of going to the West where then you would be able to do so, then you would be able to do so. So the construction of whiteness and settler colonialism were actually dual tools to keep those whites who were not economically successful as when they were working on the plantations of of white elites who were owning that, who initially ran those plantations, those who were not successful at making a living when they were initially encouraged to move west to settle this area. The people who made money were the people who were land speculators, the people who actually moved here and cleared the land. They struggled financially. So there is this use of whiteness to enable elites, plantation owners, land speculators, to take advantage of an idea of privilege that white settlers could be encouraged to take up, to make them feel like they always had the possibility of success, even though the history over the centuries of the establishing of the United States and the community here in Nashville was not one that bore that out. So I hope what I've argued for you today is that we are in need of decolonial theory. And the first, for me as an author and researcher, the first thing I need to do is to look at my tools and see what decolonial thinking can do for renovating those. I thank you very much. The corner of my slide, I acknowledge the wonderful planning that has gone into this conference by copying your logo there. And then in the other corner, there's my contact information. And that is a new website, engagetheory.net, where scholarship that uses engaged and grounded normative approaches will be available. The launch event has not happened yet, but if you go to that website, you'll get it. You can sign up and get an invitation to the launch events. And I hope you get to learn more about these methods and join me in decolonizing feminist IR and gender in the study of international relations. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I'll take your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ackerly. We consider that your presentation was amazing. I think that the topic, the importance of reaching the coloniality in this, as we say, international relations as a normative discipline is inherently violent, epistemologically speaking. Therefore, it's necessary to include these new methodologies which led us to rethink the concepts and apply them into new investigations, into new research in our area, in feminism and other areas as well. So Mariela has some problems, therefore I will be the one directing the Q&A session right now. So for everyone who wants to make a question to Dr. Ackerly, please raise your hand, open your microphone when instructed, or in case you don't have the possibility to open your microphone, you can make a question in the chat and I can read it for you. If you prefer it to read it in Spanish, I can translate it for you to Dr. Ackerly. So is there any questions from the participants of the forum to Dr. Ackerly? Okay, meanwhile, someone formulates a question. If you don't mind, I have some questions of my own. The first one is related to the typology of discourse. How do you think, well, it is important to, as you say, disgregate this idea of the global north. And usually in academics, we look up to the methodologies, to the research in order to apply them in the global south, because we don't have some of these, research theories made by ourselves. So we need to take from other parts of the world. So how do you think we can change that kind of discourse in academics in order to decolonize them and broke that structure that is like exercising epistemological violence from the global north to the global south?
I'd like to put this slide with the with these scholars who I hold in high esteem. There actually is, and I am not Spanish speaking, but there actually is a decent amount of work in Latin America that has informed how many of us do this work. Arturo Escobar has really been one of the leaders in developing, he doesn't call it grounded normative theory, but his way of doing work has always been and continues to be at that, really making the theories that we use grounded in people's experience and expanding who we have in mind when we say people, and expanding who we have in mind when we think experience. And likewise, I think Veronica Gago's work is doing the same thing, and she's, from the Global South and writing globally about sites that are not Global South. I mean, they might be Global South sites, but they're not her site. I think the more we can acknowledge that there was a problematic in the framing that the big theories came from the Global North, and because actually empirically, I don't think it's true. I think what's true is that the big theories of the Global North are the ones that get cited by scholars. And that is different from saying that all theory comes from there. And so part of using a grounded normative theory method that is informed by decolonial theory is to say, let's look at that again. Let's go back and notice, what ideas we're overlooking when we center the global North scholars in our curriculum. Now, in the Global North, one of our responsibilities is to fix our curriculum, so we're not teaching that way. So I am actually, I think many of us are engaged in decolonizing our syllabi, and that means not adding a week of decolonial theory, but really thinking about what it means to decolonize from beginning to end. I think that's one important thing we can all do. The second thing is when we are not experts, right? So I'm a consumer of decolonial thought or Indigenous thought, and I don't even read the language that it might be written in, then I think we are invited to work in partnership, but you never know what you're going to find. So I have a collaboration with a graduate student who's from Bolivia, and we have discovered problematically that while feminists from the Global North have found this idea of Tachuarme that comes from the Amara people, and feminists in the Global North have found that an interesting concept for rethinking gender, we have discovered or are arguing that that construction is itself embedded in a colonial retelling of Aymaran history, language, and peopleness, which has a recolonial aspect to it. So doing decolonial theory is not like take a book and then, run it through. It really is about rethinking and being open to having the epistemic humility and commitment to recursivity, so that even after your first inquiry that was, so eye-opening, you don't think you're done. You're really obligated intellectually by the commitment to rethink. So I would encourage, to look for your own resources, and it's like some people don't talk about their work as theoretical, but it is. They don't talk about it as methodological, but it is. And I think it's important for us to read for all kinds of wisdom in any text. Of course, I've just centered text-based inquiry, and that's yet another problem. So as long as we're willing to keep re-asking or asking anew the next question, even as we answer it, I think we're in good. I think we're practicing decolonial insights, even if we're really in the beginning or early stages or formative stages of doing so.
Thank you very much for your response, Doctor. Is there anyone who wants to place a question to Dr. Ackerly? If you are raising your hand, please tell me, because I'm not okay. Well, if no one has further questions, I want to make a second question of my own, Doctor, if you don't mind, but it's not related to the topic. I am found very interesting your work on Confucianism and democracy. I really like to go into to that. And reading your text, I have a question also relating to other readings on Confucianism, because I do consider by reading your text that it's possible to apply that idea of democracy to other parts of the world, to export it, to tropicalize it, and to adapt it in different parts of the world. However, some Chinese scholars do consider that it's not possible due to, it is called dissonance. I don't remember the name right now, but they think it is not possible. It is a Chinese experience embedded in Chinese culture and Chinese interrelation. So do you think it is not applicable to other parts, like this idea? Or, well, that's my question.
Yeah. So I love the question, and it's not unrelated to the general tenor of themes that I have. So let me see if I can do that so that those who haven't read my work on Confucianism can see the connection. So there is a standard narrative about Confucianism that it is authoritarian and hierarchical. And so there really is no place for, so that Confucian democracy would be an oxymoron, idea that doesn't fit, doesn't ring true. But what I argue about democracy, if that is equality and freedom and participation, maybe respect for rights, that those ideas are, sorry, not respect for rights, hold on that, just equality, freedom, and participation. Those ideas actually can end up to very unequal, unfree, and unparticipatory ends. That is, democracy, if we understand it as majority rule, or if we understand it as a system of decision-making that prefers the views of the majority and has no limits on it with regard to what that majority decides vis-a-vis the minority, then we can have a lot of examples of democratically endorsed oppression. You may be familiar with some in your own country. I certainly am familiar with many in my country. Democratically endorsed oppression is a real problem. The reason I pulled rights out of there is because rights is one way that liberalism historically has offered a constraint on democratically endorsed oppression. Those rights stop us, a majority, from using our weight as a majority to create unequal, unfree conditions by saying people have a right to whatever, equal rights, equal participation, or whatever. So you can't democratically exclude people, though obviously we have a history of doing so. What I argue in the paper you're talking about is that democracy itself, as I just said, democracy itself requires a check on its abuse, and that Confucianism, as opposed to liberalism, offers a different set of checks on democracy. So I wouldn't say that democracy is a Confucian idea. I'm saying if you want to do democracy in a Confucian context, Confucianism gives you good resources for doing so. You don't, for doing democracy better, you don't need liberalism. That Confucianism has the resources to check democracy. So if democracy is the general thing that can be done, I'm not saying liberal democracy is the general thing that should be exported, like another colonial export, like McDonald's, but rather that democracy is a generic thing, and that we make it culturally and historically appropriate for any given community through some other normative value system. In the East Asian context, Confucianism is available. There are other systems available in East Asian context. I just focused on the Confucianism because I wanted to make this point about democracy and liberalism. But you could argue that there are, in another context, another set of intellectual traditions that provide a normative anchor for the practices of democracy. So if democracy is a set of practices that can go It needs a normative anchor. And in liberal democracy, that normative anchor comes from liberalism. Confucianism, it could come from Confucian democracy, it could come from Confucianism. And you might argue that in your context, or that you have in mind, there would be another anchor that would provide, that would help democracy be anchored in that normative set of, normative community. Look at that, the normative values from that place and say, those are not going to be a check on democracy going badly. They could really enable things to just get worse and worse and worse. So I'm not saying every other value system is a good check on democracy. I'm saying democracy needs one. Liberalism offers one that is somewhat flawed, as illustrated by my own country's history. Confucianism is one, also flawed, as we can see in some countries' history, that it's possible. And that's the normative, that's the political implication of that normative insight. Thank you for that question. I love that.
No, thank you very much for answering. I was looking for the opportunity to make it. Well, so if there's no any more questions from the participants, Doctor, I want to thank you very much for having you here today in the name, not just of Delegación Minerva-BUAP, but also in the name of the Faculty of Law and Social Sciences and the degree on international relations. We are everyone very thankful for your participation today, and we hope we can work together in the future.
I hope so too. You have I love your heart submerging. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful delight to share with you these thoughts and get your feedback and to engage in dynamic inquiry. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much and have an amazing day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Excelente. Bueno, regresando al español, agradecemos mucho que hayan estado en esta conferencia impartida por la doctora Brooke Ackerly. En 30 minutos, a las 12 iniciará, no, una disculpa, a la 1 de la tarde iniciará la conferencia de la doctora Gabriela Barth Wigdor. Mariela va a estar de regreso, entonces ella va a ser la encargada de moderar también la presentación. Agradezco mucho, pedimos de preferencia que no salgan de la sala de Zoom para que ya en 30 minutos podamos conectarnos. Muchas gracias y cualquier duda pueden escribirnos a través